Hello, today we're going to look at the Scottish economy in the early part of the 20th century. And when we're talking about the economy here, we're really specifically talking about jobs. We're talking about the types of jobs that people did, the industries that they worked in, and the reasons that various industries grew and various industries declined. And obviously, some of this was due to the effects of World War One. Some of this is due to things that happened after the end of World War One, and some of it's due to the kind of wider effects that were affecting Scotland and the Scottish economy in particular. To get a good idea of the kind of features of the Scottish economy, having an understanding of the key statistics is quite important. So when we look at the period just before the war, we can see that 3.9% of the Scottish population were unemployed, and in Great Britain as a whole, this was 3.6%. So that is historically pretty low unemployment. Having unemployment of that level is usually seen as being reasonably good. That is a quite a good figure. However, by 1923, it was 14.3% of the Scottish population were unemployed, and in Great Britain as a whole, this was 11.6. So 14.3 is a bad figure. That is very high unemployment, and you can see that the unemployment in Scotland is quite significantly higher than it is in the rest of the United Kingdom. And we will talk a little bit about why that was. The kind of breakdowns of the different sectors, that 11% of the Scottish workforce worked in agriculture, so that's producing food and other goods like wool and things, and 47% or almost 48% of the workforce worked in industry, so almost half of the workforce working in industry, which involves directly making things. These figures have changed a bit. By 1921, there were 9.9% of people working in agriculture and almost exactly 50% of working in industry. So a decline in the number of people working in agriculture and an increase working in industry. And the decline in the number of people working in agriculture has actually continued throughout the 20th century. The number of people working in industry also began to go down later, and we ended up with a lot more people working in what we call the service sector. So that's producing services. So working in a restaurant or working in a call centre, these kind of things. These are all service jobs. Between 1921 and 1931, so basically throughout the 1920s, 37,000 jobs lost in mining, 50,000 lost in shipbuilding, and 20,000 lost in the steel industry. So really big changes. That is a very large number of jobs lost in what are thought of as the traditional industries of Scotland. So thinking about the reasons for these changes, so during the war, obviously there's a huge demand for many things that Scotland produced. So steel, ships, coal, wool and lamb and jute. These things became very important because they were needed in order to help the war effort. So this led to a boom. These industries did very well. There was a lot of jobs, there was a lot of money, there was a lot of demand. However, after the war, the demand for almost all of the things that Scottish industries produced fell. It declined because they didn't need as much coal, didn't need as many ships, didn't need much steel to produce the various kind of things to fight the war. So this led to a fall in demand, which leads to a slump. So many businesses are struggling. There is much less demand, which means there's a lot less money, which means there's a lot less jobs. So when things are doing well, we call that a boom. When things are doing badly, we call that a slump or sometimes a bust. As I said, one of the reasons for the wartime boom is that there's a much greater demand, but we can look at this in a little bit more detail. So sheep industry massively going up, lots of people employed, lots of high wages, because the government basically bought all of Scotland's wool production. They needed it for army uniforms and blankets and things like that for soldiers on the front lines. So huge demands for wool, which means huge need for the sheep industry. Wheat farmers in eastern Scotland, where they grow a lot of cereals and things, were massively in demand because they needed a lot of wheat for things like bread, so real strength there. Coal exports stopped during the war. We didn't export any coal anymore, but there was a huge need for coal back home, and this really made up for the fall in demand from foreign buyers. So there was a huge, significant growth in the coal industry, that all the coal that Scottish miners could dig was bought by the government. You need coal to power basically everything during the wartime period, plus coal is a very important ingredient when you're making steel. And steel output significantly goes up during the war. That get a huge demand for steel in ships and tanks and various other things. 90% of the armour plate used during the war for both ships and tanks was produced in Glasgow in the Parkhead foundries. The jute industry also goes up, mainly because of the demand for sandbags. The factories in Dundee were at one point producing 6 million sandbags a month. A huge number of sandbags needed for the trenches. These sandbags are obviously constantly being destroyed by shells and various other things. So the jute industry does very well. Production of jute in Calcutta was also banned during the war to kind of focus the home industries. And shipbuilding experiences a significant growth. 481 ships built on the River Clyde during the war, and profits were very good. The huge demand for ships, because ships were being sunk. They also needed more ships to transport troops, to transport food, to transport goods, and also they needed warships. So shipbuilding on the Clyde does spectacularly well. So we're looking at the effects of the war on industry. We can see it's very good. It produces a boom because there's such a high demand. The government is basically willing to buy just about everything the Scottish industry can produce. Therefore, there are a large number of jobs, lots of profits, everything seems to be doing very well. However, when the war ends, this quickly disappears. The demand goes. Huge drop in demand for Clyde-built warships. There isn't a risk of ships aren't being sunk anymore. They don't need as many warships. So Clyde experiences a huge decline in orders. This also led to big problems in the Clyde Valley, which produced a lot of iron and steel. And so you obviously need a lot of steel to produce ships, but without the demand for ships, there's a falling demand for steel. There is a huge problem in terms of new technologies. The industries in Scotland had done very well in the 19th century, but lots of other countries around the world had begun to catch up and in many ways go past Scottish industries, and the Scottish business owners weren't massively willing to invest in new technology. So this meant that the Scottish shipyards began to fall behind. They couldn't produce ships as quickly, as cheaply, and as efficiently as other shipyards. During the war, exports massively suffered because a lot of Scottish industries focused on producing things for the war effort, and so they weren't selling things abroad. This meant that other countries around the world would buy their supplies from different suppliers, different countries, so usually America, but also places like Japan. And this meant that once the war ended, it was difficult for Scotland to regain these contracts. So Scotland used to sell locomotives, train carriages to various places around the world, but this significantly declined after the war because other countries stepped in. As the industries began to contract, they needed less things, less coal, less steel. That means there was less need to transport steel around the world and transport coal around the world. And if you need to transport things less, then you need fewer ships to do it. So the demand for ships goes down. You can see that a decline in one area leads to a decline in another area, which can lead to a further decline in the first area, which leads to a bigger decline in the second area, and it's what's called a vicious circle, where things keep getting worse. There was also a big problem with strikes, what we call industrial unrest. A lot of strikes in the late 1910s and in the early 1920s, and this made a lot of buyers wary because they worried that they weren't going to get their products, they weren't going to get their coal, their steel, their ships, and so they were less willing to buy from Scottish places because they thought that there would be industrial unrest and this would prevent their ships being made, the coal being dug. Another big problem for the coal industry is that electricity and oil begin to seriously take off in the 1920s, and this massively cuts the demands for coal. In the 1920s, big fashion changes happen as well. There were demands for rayon and nylon, and these kind of new types of materials, and this meant that there was a decline in the need for cotton and wool, and a lot of the factories in Scotland that produced these kind of textiles began to suffer from serious problems, but also with the decline in the desire to have wool products also meant a big problem for the sheep farmers in the north of Scotland and textile makers in the borders of Scotland, where they make a lot of, or they used to make a lot of kind of wool clothes. And without the massive need for sandbags meant that the jute industries in Dundee had lost their main market. Also, the ending of the Calcutta ban, the ending of banning production in India, meant that a lot of the jute production could be done a lot cheaper in India, and so factories in Dundee experienced significant issues. So for a large part of the Scottish economy, the 1920s and the 1930s were a very bad time. There was a real decline in what we call the traditional heavy industries: coal, steel, ships. The industries that had really helped Scotland grow throughout the 19th century were seeing significant problems. These industries were still needed around the world, but a lot of other countries had started to surpass Scotland. However, there were some new industries that grew up that began to fill the gaps. Now, the massive decline meant that there were huge gaps, and so the new industries didn't really fill the gaps to any real extent, but there were some success stories. So there are Scottish car companies. Arrol Johnson, which was based in Paisley, began to expand after the war. The Albion Motor Company, which built trucks and buses and was a very successful company, survived until the 1980s, which is very rare for a Scottish car making or kind of motor manufacturer. Harland and Wolff, who were a very famous shipbuilder, began to build a lot more diesel engines as they move away from coal-fired ships to diesel-fired ships. Began to change, and so diesel engines became an important industry for Scotland. Grangemouth Oil Refinery was opened in 1924 to refine crude oil into the refined products like petrol and things like that, and diesel. And Grangemouth still exists today. It's a refinery just near Falkirk, and it's still in existence. So that's again a success story. Electricity begins to become an important industry, as we've said, and connecting houses and factories to the national grid becomes a very important thing. And the first new pylon is built in Edinburgh in 1928, so beginning of a very important industry. Also, with the increase in cars, meant that we needed to develop a connected industry of car insurance, and so one of the big firms is General Accident, which was in Perth in the kind of east of Scotland, and it grew significantly in the 1920s. And another important factor is that although a lot of people were suffering in the 1920s with the new industries and various other things, standards of living for some began to go up quite significantly, and with improving standards of living meant improving demands for various consumer goods. So people wanted things that they could kind of use to enjoy and that they could use to make their lives better. And this led to increasing demands for sewing machines, because a lot of people enjoyed making their own clothes or used them to kind of to darn things, to fix things. And the Singer factory in Clydebank, which was at one point the largest factory in Europe and the most advanced factory in Europe, produced a large number of sewing machines for the world markets, and it did reasonably well in the 1920s as well and experienced some growth. So what we've seen in our kind of period that we look at from 1900 to 1928 is, at first, there were strengths in the Scottish economy, and then during the war, we saw real growth with huge demand. After the war, there was significant decline because of a falling demand, but there were some success stories because there were some new industries growing up. In the exam, they can ask you about the reasons for the strength of the Scottish economy, the reasons for the decline of the Scottish economy, or the emerging new industries in the 1920s. So you could be asked an explain or a describe question about these kind of factors, and obviously you could be asked a how fully or an evaluate about these as well. So having an understanding of why Scottish industries did well, why they started to do much less well into the 1920s, and what new industries grew up is important to have in order to be able to answer all the questions that may come up.